Walter Green had always been a quiet man, his life rooted in simplicity and solitude. The small farmhouse he called home sat at the edge of a sleepy Vermont town, surrounded by acres of forest and fields where he had spent most of his adult life. The walls of the home were adorned with faded photographs of his younger years, a smiling Walter with his late wife, Ruth, at their wedding, the two of them laughing under the shade of a tree on their anniversary, and a particularly joyful image of the day they brought Bailey home from the shelter. Bailey, a golden retriever with a thick, soft coat and eyes that gleamed with endless affection, had been part of the family for over 13 years. He'd come to Walter and Ruth as a puppy, a rambunctious bundle of fur and energy that immediately captured their hearts. When Ruth passed away unexpectedly, it was Bailey who seemed to sense the shift in the air. He became Walter's unwavering companion, filling the silence in the old farmhouse that had once been full of laughter. For years, Walter and Bailey had forged an unbreakable bond. Their routine was comforting in its consistency. Every morning, Bailey would nudge Walter awake with a wet nose, wagging his tail as he eagerly waited for their morning walk. Walter, despite the years weighing on his body, always made time for it. The long strolls through the winding paths in the woods, where Bailey would chase squirrels and rabbits, and Walter would quietly take in the beauty of the changing seasons. Even in the dead of winter, when the snow blanketed the ground and the air turned bitterly cold, they continued their walks side by side. In the evenings, after a simple meal, Walter would sit in his worn armchair by the fireplace, a book resting in his lap, while Bailey stretched out on the rug at his feet. Sometimes, Walter would talk to Bailey as though he were speaking to Ruth, sharing his thoughts on the day's events or reminiscing about the old days. Bailey, ever the attentive listener, would respond with an occasional nudge of his snout or a soft, contented sigh. Their quiet companionship was a comfort, a steady presence that filled the house with a sense of peace. Neighbors often remarked on how inseparable Walter and Bailey were. The old man had become somewhat of a local figure, and everyone knew that wherever Walter went, Bailey was sure to follow. They were a sight that symbolized the kind of love that seemed to defy words, a connection between man and dog that went beyond the physical. It was a shared understanding, a bond that had been forged through years of companionship, trust, and mutual care. Walter had often said, half-jokingly, that Bailey was the only family he had left. In truth, it wasn't far from the truth. Though his children occasionally called, and there were moments when he visited his sister in town, it was Bailey who was always there, always waiting for him at the door, always ready for the next adventure, no matter how small. It was this love, this unwavering devotion, that would soon come to play a role in something neither Walter nor Bailey could have ever imagined, a twist of fate that would test the strength of their bond in ways they never could have predicted. It was a cold evening in January when everything changed for Walter and Bailey. The sky outside the farmhouse was a dull gray, clouds heavy with the threat of snow. Inside, the warm glow of the fireplace flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Walter sat in his armchair, as he often did, a book resting in his lap, though he wasn't really reading. His mind wandered to Ruth, to the years they had spent together, and to the quieter life he now led. Bailey, as usual, was lying on the rug at his feet, his eyes half closed but alert, ever watchful. There was a peacefulness to the evening, a quiet rhythm that had become their life. But that night, it was as though the air itself held its breath, waiting for something. Walter suddenly felt dizzy. His vision blurred. The warmth of the fire seemed to grow distant, as if he were falling into a deep fog. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing to the floor with a heavy thud. The book slipped from his lap and landed with a soft thump against the rug. Bailey, startled, jumped to his feet in an instant, his ears pricking forward. The dog's initial confusion turned to panic as Walter didn't rise. Bailey whined, pawing at Walter's side with increasing urgency. He nuzzled his owner's face, licking his hand, trying to rouse him. But no response came. Bailey's barking grew louder, frantic now, his body wriggling with anxiety. He was desperate, but still, Walter didn't stir. The house was silent except for Bailey's persistent cries, which seemed to echo off the walls. It was as if the dog understood something was terribly wrong, but couldn't fix it. Bailey bolted to the door and barked in desperation, hoping anyone would hear. Across the road, one of the neighbors, Mrs. Jensen, was walking her dog when she heard the frantic barking. She recognized it as Bailey's and knew something wasn't right. She rushed to the farmhouse, knocking loudly on the door. When there was no answer, she cautiously opened it and immediately froze. There, on the floor near the fire, lay Walter, unmoving. She rushed to his side, checking for a pulse. It was faint, barely there, but still present. In a panic, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911, the weight of the situation hitting her all at once. Bailey, meanwhile, was at her feet, whining as if to say, "Please, help him." Moments later, the sound of an ambulance's sirens filled the air as the paramedics arrived. Bailey watched, still intense, as they loaded Walter onto a stretcher. He followed them to the door, his eyes never leaving his owner, his heart thumping in his chest. Walter was whisked away into the night, and Bailey, unsure of what was happening, but knowing he couldn't stay behind, was left standing at the doorway, staring into the empty darkness. As the ambulance disappeared down the road, Bailey sat in the cold, still alert, waiting for his best friend to return. But in his heart, he feared the worst. He knew something had shifted, that the world had irrevocably changed in a way he could not comprehend. The deep silence of the house pressed in on him, and Bailey, for the first time in years, felt utterly alone. Bailey was not one to sit still for long, especially not after an incident as traumatic as Walter's sudden collapse. Yet in the sterile, brightly lit hospital room, he seemed to understand that there was no place else he was needed. He lay beside Walter's bed, his large, golden head resting on the edge of the mattress, his eyes never straying far from his owner. Despite the constant hum of machines and the bustle of hospital staff, Bailey remained still, unwavering. The nurses, moved by the sight of the devoted dog, allowed Bailey to stay with Walter. It was unusual, but the situation was unique. A loyal pet who had been with his owner for over a decade, a creature whose bond with Walter was beyond the ordinary. They understood that a part of Walter's spirit might be tethered to Bailey, and so they gave the golden retriever space to stay at the foot of the bed, curling into a ball at Walter's feet whenever the room quieted. Over the next few days, the hospital room became a delicate balance of routine and uncertainty. Doctors came and went, offering little more than clinical assessments of Walter's condition. His heart rate remained weak and erratic, and the beeping of the machines became a steady reminder that Walter was not truly there. He was somewhere between life and death, his mind silent, his body motionless. Bailey, though, refused to acknowledge any of it. He lay beside the bed, sometimes lifting his head and sniffing Walter's hand, his warm breath brushing across his owner's skin. At times, Bailey would gently nudge Walter's arm, as if to tell him, "I'm still here. Please wake up." The nurses marveled at Bailey's persistence. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the situation better than anyone in the room. There were moments when Walter's breathing would slow, and Bailey would sit up, ears perked, staring intently at the machines as if listening for some sign that his owner was still with him. In these moments, the air in the room felt thick with hope, as though Walter might hear Bailey's silent plea. Each day that passed felt like a lifetime to Bailey, but he never showed signs of fatigue. While other patients received flowers, cards, and visitors, Walter had something far more precious: Bailey. The golden retriever's quiet presence was a comfort, a lifeline to a world where nothing made sense. During one of the nights, the hospital staff tried to encourage Walter's children to take a break, offering to watch over Walter while they rested. They were reluctant, of course, but Bailey's unyielding vigilance had caused them to reconsider. Yet, despite their insistence, Bailey refused to leave Walter's side, even when the family stepped out for a few hours to rest. In the stillness of the room, Bailey remained as a constant, the only connection to a life once full of shared walks, laughter, and the quiet companionship of the old farmhouse. He would curl up next to Walter, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but never fully closed. He knew that if Walter were to wake, it would be because Bailey had been there all along, watching, waiting, and never once leaving. It was in these long, silent hours that Bailey seemed to have a deeper understanding of what Walter needed, not just medical care, but the love and connection only a dog could offer. Bailey's loyalty had transcended the physical realm, becoming something pure and unspoken, a bond that was impossible to break, no matter how severe the circumstances. Days blurred together in the sterile environment of the hospital, where time felt stretched and uncertain. Walter's condition remained critical, and there was no sign of improvement. His children, Sarah and Tom, had flown in from out of state to be by his side, their faces etched with worry as they sat in the waiting room, speaking in hushed tones with doctors. Bailey, ever watchful, was always nearby, lying at Walter's feet or nuzzling his side whenever the doctors made their rounds. The family had held on to hope for as long as they could, but now, with each passing day, the truth became harder to ignore. Walter's body was simply too frail, and his vital signs, though showing the occasional spike of activity, didn't suggest he was going to recover. The doctor's words were gentle, but they carried a heavy weight. They spoke of Walter's age, his medical history, and the toll this ordeal had taken on his body. Despite their best efforts, there was little more they could do. "Sometimes the kindest thing is to let them go," the doctor said softly, looking over at Bailey, who lay motionless at the foot of the bed. The golden retriever's ears twitched, sensing the change in the air. Bailey had been Walter's constant companion for over a decade, and it seemed fitting that he should be present in these final moments, if those moments had indeed come. Tom and Sarah shared a long look across the room. Their eyes were swollen with tears, but neither spoke the words they both feared to say aloud. It might be time to say goodbye. The family huddled together outside the room, talking in quiet voices. Tom, ever the pragmatist, tried to reassure his sister. "He's had a good life. We knew this day would come, just not like this, not so suddenly." Sarah wiped away a tear and nodded. "I know. I wish he could have been here for a little longer. For me. For us. He wasn't ready. We weren't ready." They had always known their father was getting older, and they'd hoped to spend more time with him. But no one had imagined his life would come to an end in such a quiet, unexpected way. And even as they discussed it, Sarah found herself looking through the glass at Walter's motionless form, praying that somehow he might wake up, that somehow the miracle they so desperately wished for would arrive. When the decision was finally made, a sense of finality settled over the family. They would begin the process of transitioning Walter into end-of-life care. They couldn't allow him to linger in a state where he wasn't truly alive. The plan was set for the next morning, to ease Walter into a peaceful rest, a quiet goodbye. As Sarah and Tom walked back into Walter's room, Bailey, who had remained perfectly still, raised his head and met their eyes. He seemed to sense the shift in the air, the gravity of the decision. For a moment, the room felt heavier, more silent than ever. Bailey's presence was undeniable, and though the humans around him could barely make sense of it, Bailey seemed to understand. He lay his head back down on the bed and quietly closed his eyes, as though accepting what was to come. But there was still something in the air, something the family couldn't place, something that made Bailey's stillness seem almost too calm, as if he were waiting for something. The morning arrived with an unsettling stillness. The soft light of dawn filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the room. Walter's children, Sarah and Tom, sat at his side, their hands gently resting on his, as if trying to will him to wake up, to show them that there was still hope. But despite the gentle encouragement and soft-spoken words, Walter remained unresponsive. The machines around him beeped steadily, but his body seemed distant, unreachable. Bailey lay at the foot of the bed, his eyes still fixed on Walter's face, his body tense but calm. The golden retriever hadn't moved in hours, not even to stretch. It was as though he too was waiting for something, a moment, a sign, a word that would bring everything back to life. The room was filled with a heavy silence, the kind that settles in when everyone knows that the inevitable is near. A nurse quietly entered, checking Walter's vital signs, nodding to herself before making a note on the chart. She moved with practiced calmness, but her eyes lingered on Bailey, who watched her every move. Bailey's gaze didn't shift from Walter, not even once. His loyalty was clear, unwavering, and the nurse couldn't help but smile softly at the sight. But as the clock ticked closer to the appointed time for Walter's transition into palliative care, something shifted in the air. Bailey, who had been lying motionless for so long, suddenly lifted his head, ears twitching slightly. His eyes, once filled with sorrow, narrowed as he focused intently on Walter's chest. There was a faint sound, a soft rustling in the room, as though the very air had changed its course. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else in the room, but Bailey's reaction was unmistakable. The dog's body stiffened, and before anyone could react, he stood and moved to Walter's side, his nose pressing gently against Walter's hand. Bailey sniffed, nudged, and then looked back at the family, his eyes wide, his stance firm. For a moment, everything in the room seemed to pause, even the soft beeping of the machines. It was then that Sarah, who had been quietly holding her father's hand, felt a sudden shift. She had been staring at Walter's still face for what felt like an eternity, her heart heavy with grief. But when she saw Bailey standing so resolutely at the foot of the bed, her breath caught in her throat. "Wait," she whispered, a flicker of hope igniting in her chest. Something's different." Tom looked up, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know. I think he's trying to tell us something," Sarah said, her voice trembling as she looked back at Bailey. She could see it in the dog's eyes, the intensity of his focus, the way his body was poised as if waiting for something to happen. The room seemed to hold its breath. The nurse, who had been watching the exchange quietly, stepped closer to Walter's bed and glanced at the monitor. Her eyes widened. His heart rate, it's picking up. For a brief, fleeting moment, the family and staff stood in disbelief. Walter's vitals, which had been steadily declining, had suddenly shown a sign of change. It was subtle, but real. His heart was beating faster, and there was a slight but definite increase in his brain activity. Bailey let out a soft whine, his tail wagging faintly as if to say, "He's still here. Don't give up yet." The nurse quickly moved to alert the doctor, and as they did, Sarah and Tom exchanged stunned glances. They couldn't explain it, but there was no denying what was happening in the room. Walter, though still deeply unconscious, seemed to be responding to Bailey in a way no one could have predicted. The seconds ticked by like hours as everyone in the room held their breath. Walter's heart rate was now steadily increasing, though still far from normal. It wasn't a dramatic shift, but it was enough to stop everyone in their tracks. The doctors and nurses, initially doubtful of any recovery, were now buzzing with quiet, cautious optimism. They moved quickly, adjusting machines and monitoring Walter's vitals with a new sense of urgency. Bailey, meanwhile, seemed to be a force of nature. His once tensed body had relaxed slightly, but his watchful eyes never left Walter. He was the only one in the room who remained unfazed, as if he knew exactly what was happening, and that it wasn't a moment for excitement, but for quiet patience. Sarah's eyes never left her father's face. Her breath came in shaky gasps as she clutched his hand, not knowing whether to believe what was happening or if it was just some sort of glitch in the machines. "Dad, please," she whispered hoarsely, her voice breaking. "Come back to us. We're still here." Tom stood by her side, equally speechless. It was as if the miracle they had never dared hope for was happening before their very eyes, though neither one could explain why or how. The nurse, who had been observing the situation closely, finally stepped forward and spoke. "It's possible. He's responding to his dog. This has been known to happen in rare cases, especially with long-term companions," she said gently, as if she didn't want to raise false hope. But there was something about the way Bailey was acting, his focused attention, the way he stood so proudly at Walter's side, that made everyone wonder if the bond between them was more than just emotional. A doctor entered the room at that moment, noticing the changes on the monitor. His expression shifted from skepticism to curiosity as he moved toward the bed. I've never seen anything like this before, he murmured, peering at the screen. Walter's vitals are stabilizing. We need to run some tests to confirm, but this is unexpected. Bailey's ears perked as the doctor spoke. He took a step forward and gently nuzzled Walter's hand again, as if urging him to keep fighting. His golden coat gleamed in the soft light of the hospital room, his gaze unblinking, as if he knew that Walter was still within reach. Tom and Sarah exchanged an incredulous look. Could this really be happening? They had prepared themselves for the worst, and now, in the span of a few moments, things were turning around. The machine continued to beep steadily as Walter's heart rate slowly approached a more normal rhythm, and the once faint lines on the screen began to show more activity. Sarah leaned down, her face close to her father's. "Dad, can you hear me?" she asked softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. She held her breath, waiting for some sort of sign. Just as she spoke, Walter's eyelids fluttered. It was the smallest movement, but to Sarah, it felt like the entire world had shifted. She gasped, her hand clutching Walter's even tighter. "Tom, look. He's moving." Bailey, sensing the change, let out a soft bark, his tail wagging more vigorously now. It was as if he too could feel the spark of life returning to his best friend. He stood taller, his body poised, waiting for Walter to fully wake, as if he knew his job was far from over. Walter's chest rose and fell with a more regular rhythm now, and the quiet murmur of voices in the room grew louder with disbelief. The nurse who had been closest to the bed moved swiftly, checking his vitals once more. "This is incredible. He's showing signs of awakening." Sarah, her voice barely a whisper, said, "Dad, please come back." For a moment, everything hung in the balance. The room fell into an uneasy silence, with only the sound of the machines and Bailey's quiet whines filling the air. It was as if the world was waiting for Walter to make his choice, to return from the brink of death, to return to the family who needed him, and to the dog who had never left his side. The room was filled with a tense anticipation as Walter's breathing began to normalize, each rise and fall of his chest more pronounced. The beeping of the machines was no longer erratic, but steady, reassuring. Bailey, whose tail had begun wagging with a gentle rhythm, stood watch over Walter, his large golden frame a constant, unwavering presence by the bedside. The nurse and doctors, who had been preparing for the worst, now found themselves quietly exchanging glances, caught between disbelief and awe. Sarah's hand trembled as she gripped Walter's, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't quite believe what was happening. Her father, who had seemed so far gone just hours earlier, was now showing signs of life. His pulse was stronger, his chest rising and falling with purpose. She whispered his name again, her voice hoarse. "Dad, please open your eyes. Please come back." For a long, breathless moment, it seemed as though nothing would happen. But then, just as the room had settled into quiet hope, Walter's fingers twitched. It was the slightest of movements, but to those who were watching, it was the first sign of true life. Bailey, who had been so still, suddenly perked up, his ears going rigid with attention. He stepped closer to the bed, his nose nuzzling Walter's hand once again, urging him to respond. His tail wagged faster now, more fervently, as if cheering Walter on to wake up. Tom, unable to hide his excitement, leaned forward. "Dad," he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you hear us? It's Tom and Sarah and Bailey. We're here." The seconds that followed seemed to stretch on endlessly. Then, slowly, Walter's eyelids fluttered, and his eyes, though unfocused and glazed, began to blink open. For a moment, it was as though time had stopped. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her face lighting up with shock and wonder. "Dad, oh my God," she gasped, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're awake." Walter's gaze shifted slowly, and his eyes landed on Sarah first, then on Tom, and finally on Bailey. There was a deep, unspoken recognition in his eyes. His hand twitched, and with incredible effort, he reached out, fingers grazing Bailey's fur. The golden retriever immediately pressed his head into Walter's hand, a low, contented whine escaping his throat. The doctors moved quickly to assess Walter, though they too were visibly stunned. His vitals are improving, and his brain activity is far more robust than expected. One of them muttered under his breath, "This is nothing short of miraculous." Bailey stood by, still as ever, with his watchful eyes fixed on Walter. It was clear that the dog was the catalyst for Walter's return. There was something undeniably magical in the bond between the two, a connection that transcended human understanding. Bailey's loyalty, his unwavering presence, seemed to have pulled Walter from the brink of death. Walter's voice, though weak, cracked the stillness. "Bailey," he rasped, his throat dry, but the word carried the weight of years of companionship. He squeezed the dog's head gently. You saved me." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she heard her father's voice again. She leaned closer, her hand resting on his arm. "We're so glad you're back, Dad. We never gave up on you." The family was overwhelmed, their hearts soaring with relief, but it was Bailey who stood in the center of it all, his head held high, as if he knew that his job wasn't finished yet. The golden retriever's loyalty had defied the odds. He had waited, stayed by his owner's side, and his belief in Walter's recovery had somehow made all the difference. In the quiet room, the bond between man and dog was undeniable, and as Walter struggled to speak, he looked up at Bailey with an expression of pure gratitude. "You're my hero, buddy." Bailey's tail wagged once again, but this time it was slow and deliberate, as though he knew his role was to bring Walter back. And now, with his mission complete, the two were once again in sync. Walter's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The doctors, though cautious, couldn't deny what had happened. In the days that followed, his condition improved steadily. The sharp decline they had feared never came. His heart rate continued to stabilize, and his vitals returned to normal. The doctors and nurses were baffled, but Sarah, Tom, and the rest of the family knew who the true hero was. Bailey had never left Walter's side, his silent dedication proving that sometimes the greatest healing power comes not from medicine, but from love. As the days went on, Walter's strength returned slowly, but steadily. He started talking more, his voice weak at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. The first time he sat up in bed on his own, Bailey was there, watching intently from the edge. When Walter slowly moved to stand, leaning heavily on the side of the bed, Bailey was right there, offering his body as support, a reminder that he was never far from Walter's side. "Easy, Dad," Tom said, steadying him as Walter tried to move toward the door. "You've been through a lot." Walter smiled weakly, but his eyes sparkled with gratitude. "I don't know what happened, but I know one thing for sure," he said, glancing down at Bailey, who stood patiently beside him, tail wagging with slow, measured motions. "If it weren't for this guy, I don't think I'd be here." Bailey looked up at him, his warm eyes filled with affection, and gently nudged his hand. Walter chuckled softly, reaching down to scratch behind his dog's ears. "You were always there, weren't you, buddy?" Tom and Sarah exchanged looks, both of them fighting back tears. They had witnessed the impossible. Their father, who had seemed so close to death, was now up and walking, all thanks to Bailey's unshakable loyalty and love. It was a bond beyond explanation, one that had withstood time, illness, and even death itself. The doctors, though skeptical at first, couldn't ignore the extraordinary recovery. "It's remarkable," one of them said, shaking his head in disbelief. "We've never seen anything like this. It's like he knew Walter needed him, and he never gave up." As Walter made his way through the hospital hallways, leaning on a walker for support, Bailey trotted beside him, just a few steps ahead, as though guiding the way. His golden fur shone in the dim hospital lights, and every step Walter took, Bailey took with him. It was as if the two were inseparable, as if they were always meant to walk side by side, no matter the obstacles life threw their way. The hospital staff watched in awe as Walter made his way to the exit, Bailey close by his side. It was a sight few would ever forget. A man and his dog, bonded by something greater than words, something that defied logic and reason. For Walter, it was a second chance at life, a gift that he couldn't quite explain, but would forever be grateful for. For Bailey, it was just another day in the life of a dog who loved his human with everything he had. As the doors of the hospital swung open and the sunlight poured in, Walter stopped for a moment and looked down at Bailey, who stood proudly beside him. He bent down and whispered, "You saved my life, Bailey. I'll never be able to thank you enough." Bailey's tail wagged slowly, but there was a look in his eyes that spoke louder than any words could. It was a look of contentment, of fulfillment. He had done his job. He had brought Walter back. And with that, the two of them stepped out into the world, ready for the next chapter of their journey, together.